after being mad for a day, I found myself diving down the Menendez rabbit hole, and this is the result. This is not the video I ever intended to make. It's a different topic that I usually cover. I watched the new Netflix series, dramatized series about the Menendez brothers, and I actually recorded a video based on my thoughts and a little bit of research, but mostly from memory of, have some memories at least of it. Leading up to that recording, I had so many bizarre tech issues that I've never had before. It took me an hour to get those ironed out. Then I recorded it, and then I just double-checked to make sure everything was fine, and it was a disaster. It's like a little gremlin showed up on my computer just while I was recording. So after being mad for a day, I found myself diving down the Menendez rabbit hole, and I have learned so much. Oh, I have even more thoughts about the show and about Lyle and Erik and what happened and their parents. I'm kind of on their side here. And this is not to justify murder, but there was way more to the story than I ever heard. Let's get into it. Welcome to True Crime, Faith, and Chocolate. I'm your host, Annette Lyon, USA Today bestselling author of the suspense novel Just One More and a whole bunch of other stuff. I'm also a true crime junkie, woman of faith, and chocoholic, which is why we are here. This is a case that has nothing to do with religion. It's intense. It's an intense one, and I will try to cover this on some level, analyzing the show from a creative standpoint as a writer and a consumer of film and television, but also in light of the things that I have learned about the case that are inaccurate and upsetting that were portrayed in the show. So I will leave a bunch of resources in the description so you can learn about some of these things yourself. But I've been digesting Menendez content for about 48 hours almost straight at this point, and the rabbit hole has no end at this point. So here we go. Here's our little nutshell version of the huge nutshell of what this case is about. So we have two brothers, Lyle and Erik Menendez. They took shotguns and destroyed their parents. It took months for the cops to figure that out. There's a lot of incompetence there. They should have figured it out much sooner. They later confessed. Massive trial. It ended in a mistrial. The second trial was not televised. It was not on camera. They were convicted in the second trial of first-degree murder and then with sentence of life without the chance for parole. And then they were put into separate prisons rather than the same one, which would have been standard. Particularly harsh punishment was for two people who had no evidence that they would ever be a danger if they were together. The story is told with a lot of flashbacks, back and forth, and some of it is unclear as to whose point of view we're in. So sometimes it's almost like the unreliable narrator, like who is viewing this event, and it's their interpretation of it. As effective as that is as a storytelling tool, it leaves some things open-ended that probably shouldn't be if it's based on a true story. It kind of begins with the murder, the day of the murder, and then we have all kinds of flashbacks and interwoven things as we go into the trial, and then the mistrial, and then the second trial, and then the sentencing, and all of that. From where I'm standing, from the things that I knew about the case going into the show, I remember when the Menendez brothers were the butt of every late-night comic, newspapers everywhere. I was in high school when it happened. Lyle is the older brother, Erik is the younger one. They were fresh adults. Prefrontal cortex not done growing. They're kids in a lot of ways, and especially with how they were raised, they didn't grow up normal. Again, I'm not excusing murder. This was essentially, as you probably know, one of the first televised trials ever. And before OJ, it was the trial of the century. However, it was not on network television. We did not have YouTube or social media. So unless you had cable, and my family did not, because we lived a rather modest life. And most of my friends did too. I literally knew like 3 people who had cable. It was like something the more wealthy people had. I just saw what I saw on the late night comics, short little clips from the evening news, newspaper articles, actual paper. So I didn't know much. And what I did know apparently is very wrong. I was under the impression all of these years that the Menendez brothers were justifying murder based on having been abused. Now, I did always believe that they had been abused. I didn't know the gory details. I've learned a whole bunch in the last few days. But I did always believe them. At the same time, abuse doesn't justify murder. What I didn't know, and I have since learned, and the show doesn't really portray this either very well. They kind of hint at bits and pieces, but there's the week leading up to the event, there were so many moments that built on each other of threats where the boys had every reason to believe their lives were in danger, that their parents were going to kill them soon. And the evening of the murder, they literally thought their parents had locked themselves behind a door and were planning to kill them that night. Imminent threat. That is a very different thing from, oh, I was sick of it, I just wanted it to stop. But it was definitely far more nuanced, and there was a whole lot more to the case. And oh my gosh, those poor boys. The things that they endured. I'll kind of run through the episodes, not entirely chronologically, but as I remember them, some notes that I made. I'll talk about the cast, the elements that were real I remember, things that I've learned since. We'll see what we can do here. The first episode is called Blame It on the Rain, which is the title of a Milli Vanilli song that was very popular when all of this broke. This group was huge when this case happened. If you're unfamiliar with Milli Vanilli, they shot to stardom, so they won a Grammy and all of this stuff. And then it came out that they were frauds, complete frauds. They did not write the music, they did not sing the music. They were lip syncing to somebody else's music. And it wasn't them that was planning it. It was this whole orchestrated thing. They were striking and they had a look. So I get why they did what they did. And it wasn't just, oh, they're lip syncing to their own track, because a lot of musicians will do that, especially on like television appearances or whatnot. It was literally not their voices. And they couldn't even string more than a couple of English words together. Their accents were so thick, and this is beyond Celine Dion having a French accent when she speaks, but sounds American when she sings. It was way beyond that. Blame It on the Rain was the name of the first episode, and they actually used 3 songs from Milli Vanilli throughout the series. And they used them really well. From a creative artistic standpoint, it kind of is this metaphor for these brothers who are not what they seem. They're a pair, a team together, carrying out a fraud, then being punished for it. It really does. It worked well on a creative standpoint. Yeah, first episode is Erik feeling guilty. He goes to his therapist and kind of spills his guts. And of course, his therapist is like, holy crap. Well, what are you telling me here? And so he makes some excuse he's going to go to the restroom or something, calls his mistress, who we find out later is also a patient. This therapist is, in reality, he was quite the tool. He says, come to his mistress. You've got to come into the office so that there's someone else here and they won't kill me. Eventually, he starts recording some of their sessions, and one in particular where he manages to get them to confess verbally again so he can have it on tape as his own personal insurance policy so they won't kill him. And they don't know that at first, but later. And the therapist is played by Dallas Roberts, who, holy crap, looks nothing like his other appearances in other shows. It was mind-boggling to go, that's the same dude? What? Compare these. It's wild. So Dallas Roberts plays Dr. Orziel. An amazing performance. I'll just say that. He testified in the trial, and his mistress, her name was Judalon Smith, spelled with a Y, Smith. And she is played by Leslie Grossman. You know what? Let's just dive into who plays Lyle and Erik. So Lyle Menendez is played by Nicholas Alexander Chavez. Erik is played by Cooper Koch. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce it, because like the Koch brothers, that's how it's spelled. Cooper playing Erik blew my mind. He studied Erik, you can tell. There were moments where I was like, oh my gosh, I recognize that facial expression from clips I've seen of the trial. Like that's exactly how Erik cries, how he emotes, how he listens. Cooper nailed it. Then you get Lyle, the older brother, of course played by Nicholas Alexander Chavez. He was an excellent actor. Didn't quite nail Lyle's mannerisms and all of that, but I will say he did the best he could with what he was given. They portray Lyle kind of as a narcissistic sociopath, an absolute egotistical, bratty rich kid, and a mastermind. And nothing I've seen, even watching it, I was like, I don't think that's how it was. Everything I saw of Lyle is protective older brother. He might have had a temper at some point, but not this nastiness that's in the show. I can appreciate that Nicholas didn't have a whole lot to work with as far as making it accurate. He did do a great job with what he was given. He portrayed the character they wrote for him. I really struggle with his portrayal because he's such a jerk, and I don't think that's who Lyle is or was. And for those who like me, I could never remember which brother was which. They look different enough, but they also look enough like brothers that I was like, I can't tell them apart enough to attach a name to one or the other. And now I can. because I learned that Lyle he started losing his hair around the age of 14. Poor kid. And I have to wonder if some of that was the result of stress and trauma. But he was losing his hair, and so he had a hairpiece, a toupee, a rug. It was a secret. I found out the week they killed their parents. Their mother had a fight with Lyle. And there's some things, this is not in the show, this part. From things that I've seen, it seems likely that the argument was about the hairpiece and how their father, Jose, was not going to pay for it anymore. And she literally ripped it off his head, which was incredibly painful, number one, because you're supposed to put this chemical on to help release it. Number two, it was also humiliating, absolutely humiliating for the boy to suddenly be standing there bald. And that's when Erik found out that Lyle had a hairpiece. He had no idea up to that point. So that was one of many ways even their mother was abusive. After the parents' death, police and the brothers are saying, well, maybe it was a mob hit. Maybe it was some other business deal gone bad because his dad worked in Hollywood. So maybe there was some sort of deal that was done that made him enemies. The mob hit idea is odd that got any traction at all, because mob hits are very precise and planned. This was a hot August night. This was August of 1989. Windows were open to cool things off, and it was very clearly a disorganized crime scene. It was bloody, it was messy, it was chaotic, and with the windows and doors open, the neighbors heard stuff. No one called the police, but neighbors later said that they heard the shots from shotguns, which are loud. Yeah, the idea that this was a mob hit, it's bizarre that they ever considered that. Second episode talks a lot of the public perception of the boys immediately after the crime, or in the weeks after, and how they supposedly just went on this huge spending spree. That kind of cemented the idea in the public's mind, and this is what the prosecution then ran with, was that the motive was money. They wanted their parents' money. Forget the fact that they already had access. Their parents lavished them with money. They would say, hey, can I have this? Sure, here's some money. They did not want for money before their parents died. There was a life insurance policy that wouldn't quite kick in until their father went in for the physical. If money had been the motive, it would have made sense to wait a little longer. And the boys were aware of this policy because they would hear their mother rant because, your dad isn't getting that physical. How annoying. So they knew it was pending. Why wouldn't they have just waited? There are a lot of things like that. And if you look at how the boys spent money before, they were very, very rich. So going out and buying expensive clothes, and they each bought a car. Erik's car was a Jeep, nothing particularly fancy, and Lyle's, I think it was an Alfa Romeo. Actually, between the two brothers, Erik spent very, very little in comparison, and like 10% of it, and then Lyle spent most of it. And what Lyle was doing was, he did buy some Rolexes and that kind of thing, some really expensive stuff, but they were also contacting their aunts and uncles and saying, is it okay if I buy this? What do you think? Getting permission and feedback. You have to remember just the scope of money. $10,000 to them does not, especially in the 80s, that was way more than it is today. But that meant less to them than it would to me today, because the money was no object. Part of the money that was spent on Erik's clothing was because he didn't have a wardrobe that would be fitting for even their parents' memorial. He just walked around in tennis clothes all the time. Erik spent a lot of money on tennis lessons, and he spent his days with a very strict schedule. Lyle spent a lot of money on investments, including in a restaurant he had long talked about wanting to do. So it wasn't just, we're going to just spend our parents' money, woohoo, look at us. But that was very much the public impression. They both played a lot of tennis. Lyle, seems like once he went to college, less so. Erik was doing a lot of tournaments, and he was supposed to be like maybe get on a scholarship or something to go to college with that. So he actually was in a tournament in Israel when the cops wanted to arrest them, and it was his first attorney, Robert Shapiro, you might know that name from other cases, who convinced him to come home and turn himself in. They're arrested finally. And then we see life behind bars for them, and how dimes were incredibly important because that was how you could call it to the outside world. So we see in the show, Lyle like bartering really expensive items that he can buy for a fellow inmate's 10 dimes or whatever, because the dimes are so valuable because he needed to call out. And unfortunately, the show makes it sound like he was constantly witness tampering and trying to convince friends to lie for him. There's one case, it appears, that he did kind of tried to get someone to tell a different variation of a story, but it wasn't this widespread thing like the show tries to make it out to be. The show also seems to, and this is later in the series, but they go into supposedly that she had all of these tapes of their conversations, that he confessed all of these things, and how, we really pulled the wool over half of the country's eyes in the first trial. We just have to do that for the other half of the country in the second trial. I put it on a really good acting job. We just fooled everybody. In fact, Dominic Dunn, who was a writer, people used to say he's a reporter. He was actually a novelist first. He used those fictional writing skills when he was then started covering true crime. And he was passionate, though, about true crime, and usually was pro-prosecution because of a case where his own daughter had been strangled to death by her abusive boyfriend, and he got like a sentence of, I think, 4 years, but only served like 2. So he was infuriated by that and then went into the true crime world. So he became really famous when he was covering the OJ case, but he also he covered the Menendez case as well. But it came out that he had paid this girl a lot of money to say that she had these recordings of Lyle, which did not actually exist. But the show plays up the idea that they did exist, and that's why Lyle didn't testify in the second trial. So Dominic Dunn shows up in the show quite a bit. I will say he's played by Nathan Lane, and it's a phenomenal performance because I know who Dominic Dunn was. I know what he looked like and sounded like. And this is a performance where Nathan Lane, he's one of those actors who often plays variations of himself. You know, if you have a Nathan Lane character, you can kind of picture what that will be. He really tried to embody Dominic Dunn. And there are moments that flash back to when his daughter died, that he is just a grief-stricken father. He does an amazing job with that. I take issue with how the writers and the producers portrayed him, because he was a storytelling tool. He would have, for example, in real life, he did have people over for these dinners and he would chat about true crime cases. That really happened. So they used that as a tool to show how the public was thinking. He was kind of a stand-in for all of the media and the opinions of the outside world, and maybe some things were going on with the case that we might not otherwise know about, a way to summarize things and get things across to the viewer. So it worked in that regard. But the fact that he paid this woman to lie about this recording kind of undercuts a lot of what his claims were at the time, and that's really kind of gross. We move forward to where Lyle's describing the abuse he endured. Now, one thing I didn't know until I started digging more into this, and the show doesn't go into this at all, is that the kids grew up on the East Coast. They lived in various places in New York, I believe in New Jersey as well. They moved to the Los Angeles area just the year before. So the boys grew up in New England. Most of their lives, that's where they were. Very different than having just these spoiled Beverly Hills boys. That's not what they were. They really were not. And their parents weren't rich when they were very young, because their father made a lot of money as they grew up. And I also didn't realize that, it makes sense that Lyle, he was college age, right? So he had been going to college for a while. He didn't really know what was going on at home, had no idea that his little brother was being abused the way he was. And he himself had been abused, but for him, it stopped, I believe, around the ages of 7 or 8. And he had no idea that his father had just turned his attention to Erik instead. And that with Erik, it had never stopped. And that was horrifying. And he found out about this the week of the murders. And that was one more match to the bonfire. Lyle had been going to Princeton. I believe he flunked out. He was having all kinds of emotional issues and I suspect trauma issues, maybe attention stuff. The perfectionist need to perform for their abusive father. He was so bad, you guys. He had worked his way back in. I don't remember all the details, and it doesn't really matter, but he was home temporarily in Los Angeles, which wasn't his home. And he was staying it was a very different dynamic from what I had pictured in my head. Erik had been abused almost his entire life and had never stopped. And he had stood up to his dad only a couple of times as a teenager. He wanted it to stop, and his dad just basically beat the crap out of him and said, if you ever say no again, I will kill you. And his dad, after that point, had always followed through on any threat he gave. So why would Lyle or Erik not think that he would follow through with that? I also learned that week, and this is all in the wake of the hairpiece being ripped off and all of that. One of the major things that kind of got the ball rolling. And this was not in the miniseries. For Erik, he was like, okay, I'm going to college in the fall. In just a few more weeks, I got to go to college. He was going to college in California, but he and Lyle were planning that he could transfer to Princeton and they could be together on the East Coast. Erik, in his mind, college was his out. When I finally grow up, I can leave the house, I can go to college, and this will end. He didn't feel like he could leave. It's this learned helplessness. I think we understand that better with abuse today than we did back then. But even in court, well, why didn't you just go drive in a car and leave and never look back instead of if you thought your life was in danger? Lyle said, where would we have gone? My dad was very powerful and had a lot of money. He would have found us anywhere and still killed us. So you have to get into that mentality. And then they brought up things like, was this statement or that statement really a threat? Doesn't sound like it to me. And then I thought back, two big things that just really jumped to my mind. One was Charles Vallow. If you're familiar at all with the Chad Daybell, Lori Vallow case, Charles was the husband before Chad, shot to death by Lori's brother Alex, on her and Chad's direction, essentially. At least allegedly, she's awaiting a trial for that murder in Arizona as we speak. If you can look up the body cam footage of Charles calling the police and saying, my wife is threatening my life. She has gone off the deep end, did this weird religious cult extreme thing, and she is threatening to kill me. And the police say, what did she actually say? And he says things like, well, she said that she would destroy me, that she can take me out, that she can... He's phrasing it in ways that he knows she means she wants him dead. But she didn't use the words kill. So the police say, well, that's not an actual threat. Fast forward a few weeks and he is dead. So he knew that that was a real threat. The cops looking in did not think it was. A less dramatic case in some ways, but when I was in high school, we adopted a cat. My sister worked at this animal store hospital thing, and this cat had been brought in, supposedly was, peeing all over the house or whatever, and the owner wanted to get rid of it. Sweet, sweet cat. And my sister was like, oh, we have to put this cat down. She's not adopted in the next 24 hours. Can we please bring her home? So we brought Sable home. That's what we named her. But she was terrified. For the longest time, she would hide in closets. If she was sitting in the hallway and you were approaching the hall, she would bolt before you could get close. And we figured out pretty quickly that she had been abused in her last home. And it took months for her to learn that she was in a safe place now. And eventually, by the end of her life, she would lie across an entire step on the stairs, and we would have to take the next step up. She's like, yeah, you'll step over me. You're not going to hurt me now. But for her, just the approach of someone walking was a threat, because that had been a threat to her before in her previous home. So I think of that as well when it comes to children who've been abused. When Lyle found out that his dad was abusing Erik, he confronted him. He said, I won't tell anyone as long as it stops. And his father, who had never really had someone give him an ultimatum or really ever said no successfully, he had been sitting back on his chair, and suddenly he unfolds his legs and leans forward and says something to the effect of, Erik has made his choice and you've made yours. And now you can face the consequence. Basically, he knew that his dad was threatening to get rid of them. He says, you're going to tell no matter what I do. You're going to tell someone. And Lyle actually was not. He had already been keeping secrets his whole life. He was not going to tell anyone. But his dad believed he would. And basically, whatever he said that night was a threat to kill them both. And they fully believed that he would, because their public personas were so important to their parents. Something else that happened that week, Lyle, make that Erik, had one more encounter with his dad and was trying to make it stop. And of course, he was abused again. And he walks downstairs. He's visibly upset. And his mother is drunk or possibly on drugs, but she's kind of out of it. And she goes, what's wrong with you? And of course, she has never been a mothering figure. She's been mean to them both. She was abusive to them both. She did some molestation stuff to them both. Not to the level of their father, but she was far from innocent. And so, what's wrong with you? He says, nothing, Mom, nothing you'd understand. And she goes, oh, I understand. Much better than you think. And Erik on the stand said, it sounded like she meant that she knew about the abuse. He had been hiding that secret since he had been a little child. Since it began for him when he was just maybe 5 or thereabouts. He had been hiding the secret thinking, I can't destroy Mom's life. If she finds out, then she'll have to protect me and that will destroy the family. And now she's saying, is she seriously saying that she already knows? So he's like, what do you mean? What do you mean? You don't know what I'm talking about. And she's like, what, do you think I'm stupid? I've always known.
No! No!
And so he said from that moment on, and this was just, I think maybe a day or two before they died, from that moment on, Erik said, she and his father were kind of the same person. They were both complicit. And then the night of the actual killing, and this is something that is not shown at all in the show, is the events that night that made them think that their death was being planned that night. I'll link to some of my sources in the description. I highly recommend watching some of those that go into a lot of detail because it's very enlightening. But I do believe that they thought their lives were in danger that night. And from the outside looking in, someone else would say, your dad uncrossed his legs and leaned forward. But they were like, oh, no, that was a threat. Episode 5. We end up, it's called Hurt Man. And that actually apparently was a nickname that Erik gave himself. It was very meaningful, but his friends thought it was just a nickname. They don't actually describe that in the show. I found that out elsewhere, but it's the name of the episode. And it's fitting. And there's one scene that from a creative and filmmaking standpoint was so well done. I think it's just one shot. So it's this really long monologue that Erik is giving with essentially just a couple of interjections from his lawyer. Let's see, Ari Gaynor, I think her name is, playing Leslie Abramson. They're in a jail room, and there's a table. She's on one side, he's on the other. And the camera's over her right shoulder. She's on the left of the screen, and he is then on the other side of the screen facing the camera. They zoom in so slowly, you don't realize it's happening. You can't even see it happening. And you're like, wait, Leslie's only half her head's in the shot now. What's going on? And by the end, it's just Erik. But he's telling about a lot of the abuse that he endured. There's way more that happened than they even say in the show. It's a powerful scene. Something else that it really made me sad with Erik in particular. There was a lot of talk in the media, even in court, about whether Erik was gay. As if that should matter. Keep in mind that the trials were happening in the early to mid-90s, and this is just shortly after the AIDS crisis. Very much a stigma still. I did see something that some people said the show was homophobic. I don't think it was, because in my perception anyway, was that Erik was conflicted on his own identity because of what his father had done to him. And this is the Erik in the show, not necessarily the real one. But I can see this might well have been the real one too. Am I attracted to men because of what my dad did to me? Or would I have been born that way anyway? Am I bi? Am I hetero? And it was like this mourning the loss of this core identity because he didn't know. He didn't have that opportunity to figure that out. That he didn't know. Am I just naturally bi? Am I gay? I don't know. He took away the opportunity for me to know who I am. And that broke my heart. The show moves on to talk a bit more about Jose and Kitty's relationship. It was never good. She was this beauty queen, and it was abusive both directions. He was definitely the primary aggressor. She never wanted to be a mother, very clearly blamed her children for her miserable life and all of her problems. She was abusive to them when Jose was not home. She found out about an 8-year affair that Jose was having, and even took that out on the boys on some level. She was particularly mean to Lyle because she could see that he was the favorite son, that Jose almost seemed to love his older son more than he loved his own wife. A lot from the first trial and the 2 different lawyers that were representing the boys. Again, that's Leslie Abramson represented Erik, and then Jill Lansing represented Lyle. And that she's played by Jess Weixler. I hope I said that right. They both do a great job. Apparently there were 2 juries in the room. So it wasn't just that they were being tried at the same time. They actually had 2 separate juries different counsel, all that. Although the defense counsel was largely created by Leslie Abramson, she was a pit bull of a lawyer. Amazing, amazing work. She got off a lot of creepy people too, but in this case, she was almost like the mother that Erik never had. The second to last episode is called Seismic Shifts, and it goes into shifts in everything. There was a mistrial, which was a shock to so many people. And the really sad part in the mistrial was that the juries were split largely along gender lines. The women believed the boys, and the men did not. And it wasn't even, was it justified? A lot of these men could not believe that man-on-boy abuse could exist. They refused to even consider it. That's not a thing. A father wouldn't do that. And they blamed the women for being too emotional and falling for it. But they're blaming the women for being too emotional as they are literally banging on the table in the jury room and calling them bitches and being furious and yelling at these women, saying that you're being too emotional. Okay, men. Yay, misogyny. So that was a problem. And then they learned later that the men did not like Leslie Abramson. They thought she was abrasive. And yet I'm sure if a man had defended someone the same way, he would be considered a powerful, assertive attorney. So yeah, in this episode, the Seismic Shifts, they also use the 1994 Northridge earthquake in California as a metaphor for all of these changes that are happening. Leslie Abramson adopts a child. That really happened. The brothers, they portray the brothers having a rift between them, that Lyle had been doing all this witness tampering and all the recordings, plural, supposedly, that his girlfriend had made, again, which now we know did not actually exist. And there was only one witness, potentially, that he tampered with, and even that was questionable. Also, that supposedly Lyle blamed Erik for this whole thing. If Erik hadn't said, Dad's doing this to me, I'm scared, then none of this would have happened. Which technically sort of, but it's a lot more complicated than that, and I don't think Lyle was that mean and cruel. They were very close siblings, and if anything, Lyle was a protector of his little brother, he wasn't going to turn against him. But after the first trial, all of the family money that the boys had access to was gone. And Leslie, as much as she wanted to stay on the case, she thought, I can't unless I can be paid, because as she put it, actually, in a press conference, there are things like mortgages and needing to eat. So she says, I want to stay on if I can. Jill Lansing, she left the case for personal reasons. The show makes it sound like it was for money, financial reasons. But Leslie petitioned the court and said, can I be appointed his counsel and be paid as a public defender would? So she took a massive pay cut, what she would normally get as a private defense attorney, so she could continue to represent Erik, which I thought was really cool. That was granted. In the second trial, same judge, which that is usually the case for second trials, and I wish it weren't. Because if there's a mistrial, maybe the judge was at fault. And in this situation, it's mind-blowing to me that, I don't know, this judge should not have been on the case for the second trial. He reversed a lot of his own rulings. The only one I can kind of agree with is maybe not having cameras in the courtroom, because that led to such a circus the first time. But he did not allow in the second trial for anything other than first-degree murder to be on the table. And the jury was not allowed to consider self-defense, which was the entire argument. That the boys believed, whether or not it was actually the case, they believed and had cause to believe based on events throughout their life and of that week and including that day, they had reason to believe that their lives were in jeopardy. And based on that, they could have gotten manslaughter. That would have been a manslaughter charge. And this is not to say they should have walked. They should have had some kind of consequence, but they should have been able to have a lower level charge. And the judge refused to let the jury consider that argument at all. He knew that's what the argument was because he had seen it in the first trial for 5 months. He let the same defense go on. In the second trial, he refused to let many of the same witnesses come in, saying, oh, they're just cumulative, when they weren't. He denied a whole bunch of other stuff. There were so many things that it was so clearly not a fair trial. If you've watched me at all, you know I'm very much for justice. I want the bad guys to be locked up to pay for their crimes. We also need a fair justice system. That is what ours is based on. Anyone who gets arrested has certain rights. And if I were to be falsely accused of something, I would hope I would have a fair trial. Even if everyone in the room thinks I'm guilty, I hope I would have a fair trial and I could prove my innocence. This second trial was not a fair trial. There's so much in it that was just bonkers wrong. They just completely gutted the defense. Many people have said, including an appellate judge in California, mind you, who actually even said, oh, well, he just wanted a conviction because he was up for re-election, this judge was. The state attorney's office they had lost some big high-profile cases, including the OJ case, which overlapped. That was a huge black eye. There was the Rodney King verdict, and then the resulting LA riots. So coming off of those two things, they needed a win. And a lot of people believe, including an appellate judge, that this judge did everything he could to set up the case in such a way in the second trial that they would win. With what the jury was given and what they were allowed to consider, they really didn't have much choice because the brothers admitted to killing their parents. But they weren't allowed to consider manslaughter or self-defense. So they had to come back with a first-degree murder. And then in the penalty phase, the only options they could consider, as it is in many places when it's a first-degree murder charge, life without parole or the death penalty. And at the time would have been the gas chamber. That's all that they could consider, which is horrifying to me. You need more options. That's awful. So as I was watching it, though, this is another little moment where for entertainment purposes, I was glad to see it. We have a moment after the second trial where we're seeing the jury debate. And there's one woman, they call her Lee. I have no idea if any of this really happened. If it did, seriously cool. Someone has a guardian angel. She was mad and yelling and saying, I don't believe any of this abuse happened. These are monsters. They're sociopaths. They deserve the death penalty. And you will not sway me from voting otherwise. And I believe they had to have a unanimous vote to get that. And as she's acting and yelling and getting all mad, I'm going, wait a minute. That voice is familiar. Those facial expressions are familiar. And then I went, hold up. Is that Vicki Lawrence? I looked it up and it is. It's Vicki Lawrence. Child cameo. So if you're not old like me, then you might know her from Hannah Montana. She shows up a couple times in that show. But most of us would know her from Mama's Family and the Carol Burnett show. She's fantastic. But yeah, that's a fun little cameo to watch for. So they have this character going off, and then she collapses. I can't remember if they said it was a stroke or heart attack or what, but she's out of commission, so they bring in an alternate who had been, of course, observing the whole trial as well, and he could not bear to have these men's lives on his hands, their blood on his hands. He couldn't handle the weight of that. He felt that, yes, they did this, but they shouldn't die for it. If not for that woman, if Lee was real, named something else maybe, but if that really happened, we can be grateful that it was this one alternate who came in and basically saved the boys' lives. Earlier on, going with the whole Milli Vanilli bit, they show the memorial service and have Lyle deciding to play a Milli Vanilli song in the memorial. Girl, I'm Gonna Miss You, which is actually one of their better songs, I think. When I was doing a little bit of research, it looked like they really had played that song at the memorial. And I was like, that's bonkers. But that probably gave the creators of the show the idea to, what if we work Milli Vanilli into the plot line in a metaphorical sense and play more than one song, played it with all of that, and they totally did. But I've since even seen a video of one of the cousins of Lyle and Erik saying, that is the most bizarre revisionist thing ever, playing that song at the memorial. Are you kidding me? That didn't happen. So I don't know. I have no idea. It doesn't sound like that happened, but a lot of people have reported it as being real, and I believe the filmmakers believed it and then played with it. That song, though, Girl, I'm Gonna Miss You, they play it again right at the end of the limited series. Broke my heart. They're being transferred to prison from jail now that the sentence has been handed down. And you see one being led, of course, in shackles into this white van, and he looks over, and I'm forgetting which it was first, but probably Erik first. Then he looks over and he sees Lyle getting into this other van, and they kind of nod and smile at each other, and Girl, I'm Gonna Miss You is playing in the background. The lyrics are poignant and fitting for the moment, in the sense of, as the dream is over and all of these things that we did together it's over. It's like, oh yeah, that really fits. Then there's a kind of an artistic moment. Obviously it didn't happen exactly like this, but it was a beautiful shot. The vans are driving side by side. There's a drone shot above, and you see them parting and curving off exactly parallel at the same time, away from each other. And that's when the brothers go, whoa, 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 wait. And one of them says, I thought I was going to Folsom. And he goes, oh, you are. your brother's not. And that they were taken onto two separate prisons. That was not standard. A lot of people thought that was the prosecution, this one particular attorney being spiteful, trying to add additional punishment, which was not his position to do. They never got a chance to say goodbye. And they didn't see each other again at all until 2018. So over 20 years, now they've been moved into the same prison facility. Now that I've done so much research and listening to things and having watched the show, I can appreciate what it was trying to accomplish creatively, artistically. I did a great job with a lot of those things, but when it came to the truth, there was a lot that didn't sit right with me. So much nuance was gone. Yes, Kitty was portrayed as a horrible person, but she was actually far worse than that. Yes, the brothers did it, but it wasn't as conniving as they made it out to be. Lyle was likely the leader as the older brother, wanting to protect his little brother, but I never got the impression at all that he was arrogant or a sociopath or just a spoiled rich brat kid at all. And if you watch behavioral analysts, like the behavior panel, there's a few others, analyzing them, I've watched several, their testimonies feel very truthful. There are details that they include that if they were trying to make it up, they wouldn't have said that. Actually, it might make them look worse. Or there's a moment where it's like PTSD and that kind of thing. Trauma was not nearly as well understood then as it is today. And yet today we can look back and go, oh my goodness, there's a moment in the courtroom where Erik is asked a specific question, and the first part of the question is so painful that he lowers his head and puts his head in his hands, and then when he lifts his head back up, he goes, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of the question. His brain short-circuited. He had dissociated for a few minutes, or for a few seconds. Apparently all of his school teachers and his coaches, like all of them, reported seeing that kind of thing, that he would zone out like he wasn't there for a minute, which is so common among trauma survivors. And that's not something he would have thought to fake. And then they're crying. It was absolutely, there's certain muscles in the face that are hard to control or move together at the same time if you're trying to act and do it intentionally. Some people can, but it's very rare that it happens when you're genuinely sad. If you're pretending to cry, you don't have tears. These were snotty tear crying. Would they have been acting? Teeny tiny possibility. You can't completely rule it out. But gosh, Mark from the behavior panel, the way he put it is, if these boys were acting, they are better actors than Anthony Hopkins. Everything they're doing is so spot on with truthfulness. With everything that I've seen and heard and read, I believe at this point they're guilty. They should have been found guilty, I believe, of something like manslaughter. They do not pose a danger. The only people that they ever posed any kind of danger toward were their abusers. They've been exemplary prisoners, tried to make a good impact on society from prison, despite horrible odds. There's no point in being punitive. There's no point in keeping them in prison for the public's safety because they're not dangerous. I think it's time to let them free. Basically, they've been in prison since they were arrested in 1990. That's 34 years and counting. I think they've served their time. When there are people who have committed worse crimes who got lesser sentences, I think they've paid. I think they've paid for their crimes, and I think it's time they come out. So yeah, this was very different from my usual stuff. As a mother, it just breaks my heart. I want to just throttle Kitty for not protecting her kids. What a narcissist. So I gotta shake some of this off. That was deep, and can't stay here too long, or that's intense. So we're gonna need some chocolate. Let me know if you would like me to talk about any other TV shows, films based on true crime cases. If you like this kind of thing, I can definitely do more. There are many that are related to religious stuff that I can definitely cover. Many that I've seen, I might have to rewatch to refresh my memory and get my snarky opinions ready. But let me know what you think of this, and if you would like me to see more of this kind of content in addition to my regular stuff. If you like the video, please give it a like, subscribe if you're new, and until next time, go get yourself something sweet.